Section 20 of Rough Notes taken during some rapid journeys across the Pampas and among the Andes by Francis Bond Head. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Memorandum A. Those who propose to work a mine in Cornwall have the following advantages over those who propose with the same people to work a mine in South America. 1. In Cornwall, previous to commencing operations, they may inspect the mine themselves and call any number of practical men to assist them. In South America, they cannot do this, but must commit this important duty to one or more individuals. 2. In Cornwall, the lode is in a country whose climate is favorable to great bodily exertion, and the general character of which is industry. But in South America, the climate and excessive heat are unfavorable to great bodily exertion, and the general character of the country is indolence. 3. In Cornwall, the miners are subjected to a code of most admirable local regulations, which encourage competition and industry, and leave the idle to starve. In South America, the miners are away from the force of all these regulations, and a high fixed salary with cheap wines and provisions discourage competition and labor. 4. In Cornwall, although the miners have no theory, no schools, no books, yet from long practice and experience they most perfectly understand the geological construction of the country, the particular nature of the ores they seek, and the difficulties which they are likely to meet with. In South America, the geological construction of the Andes and the mountains in which the mines are situated is unknown to the Cornish miner. He is unacquainted with the ores he is to seek. The muriates, carbonates, pacos, colorados, and other non-resplendent ores are by him so unnoticed and undervalued that the native miner has actually to point out to him the riches of the mine he has come to improve. 5. In Cornwall, the greatest difficulties are the subterraneous streams, which in a humid climate and in a flat country so influence the plan of operations that the art of mining in Cornwall is the art of draining, not on a general principle, but adapted to the geology of the country. In South America, as it never rains at Uspallata and seldom rains in Chile, and as the winter showers, instead of sinking into the earth, rush down the precipitous sides of the mountains in which the lodes are situated, there is but little water, and therefore the Cornish plan of operations, and consequently the experience which the Cornish miner has gained, is inapplicable, for the difficulties which he has learnt to overcome do not exist, while others oppose him which he has never been accustomed to meet. In Cornwall, to drain the mines, steam engines can be procured at a short notice, and if for any particular object a large body of men are required for a few days, they can always be had. Also, whatever tools, wood, iron, rope, etc., may be required, can be obtained with a facility and punctuality known only in England. In South America, from the absence of water, the overpowering force of steam is unnecessary, inapplicable, and its great advantage is unattainable. In case of unforeseen difficulties, requiring for a few days the assistance of a large body of extra laborers, it would be absolutely impossible to obtain them. Tools, iron, and materials could only be procured with the greatest possible difficulty. In many situations it would be necessary to send several hundred miles for materials. The purchaser would be assailed by every endeavor and combination to defraud. They would be delivered at a great expense of time and money. And in a country in which contracts are not understood, and time is of no value, there would be the most serious delays and disappointments. 7. In Cornwall, the expenses of the mines are known. The customary wages of the captains of the mines, the pay of the miners, who all work by tribute or by task work, are accurately calculated. The price of tools, iron, wood, rope, and all materials is known, and the sale of the ores by public auction gives an immediate and certain return. In South America, the expenses of each mine can never be anticipated. The wages of the English captains and miners are very high. Every article, if purchased 1,000 times, would be the subject of a new bargain, and materials would be perhaps of double or treble cost, according to the people and the spots from which they were to be obtained. After the extraction and reduction of the ores, the process of smelting and amalgamation, which in Cornwall are unknown, the Cornish ores being always smelted in Wales, would be required. 8. In Cornwall, in case it should be deemed necessary to abandon the mine, the men can be discharged, the engines can be removed, the materials can be sold by auction, and the loss is only what has actually been spent on the mine. In South America, in case the mine should be deserted, to the sum sunk in the mine is to be added the expense of the men getting to the spot and returning, which in many cases would be very great, the construction of houses for officers and men, as also the establishments for smelting and amalgamation, the cost of engines and stores, which it would oftener be cheaper to abandon than to remove. 9. In Cornwall, the resources of a great mercantile country are so extensive that public competition suppresses every sort of unjust combination. But among small communities of men this would be impossible, and without the slightest intention to blame any individual, I must declare that from the Atlantic to the Pacific I found that Englishmen and foreigners were preparing to monopolize every article that could be required for mining purposes, and that a large English capital, belonging sometimes to A and sometimes to B, was considered by a pack of people as a headless, unprotected carcass, which was a fair subject for universal worry. Memorandum B. Comparing the past and the present value of the mines in South America. On the discovery of the different countries in South America, the attention of the Spaniards was immediately directed towards the acquisition of those metals which all men are so desirous to obtain. Careless of the beauty of these interesting countries, their sole object was to reach the mines, and hence it is that the history of the American mines has always been considered the best history of the country. As soon as information was obtained from the Indians of the situation of the mines, however remote, small settlements were formed there, and with no other resources or supplies than those which nature had bestowed upon the country, they commenced their labors. they obtained their reward, and the arrival of the precious metals in Europe was hailed as the produce of intrepidity, industry, and science. The mode, however, in which these riches were at first obtained forms one of the most guilty pages in the moral history of man, and the cruelties which were exercised in the American mines are a blot on the escutcheon of human nature which can never be effaced or concealed, and which is now only to be confessed with humility and contrition. Besides the mita, or forced labor of the Indians, the particular cruelty of which is not the present object to describe, the whole system was one of extortion and oppression. The miners were barely sheltered from the weather. The use of all spirits was forbidden. Their food was coarse, and the weighty tools which were placed in their hands were in themselves emblems of the ignorance, cruelty, and avarice of their masters. However, there is no situation of misery or suffering to which the mind and body of man cannot be inured. The miner by degrees became accustomed to his labor and his tools. The slave toiling under his load ceased to complain. The cry of the sufferers became gradually silent, and in a short time no sound issued from the gloomy chamber of the mine but the occasional explosion of powder, the ringing blow of the hammer, and the faint whistle of the slaves, who thus informed the overseer that they had reached those points of the shafts at which by law they were allowed to rest. The mine was said to have assumed a prosperous appearance, and men were talking aloud of the flourishing state of the South American colonies, and of the inexhaustible riches of the mines, when the spell was gradually broken. The revolution at last broke out, and as if by magic the miner found himself in the plain surrounded by his countrymen, marching forward in support of liberty, and lending his arm to exterminate from La Patria the oppressors who were now trembling before them. All the poor mines in South America from this moment were deserted, and the country was for many years in a state of warfare which it is not necessary to describe. But as soon as the victory was gained and independence gradually established, one of the first acts to which many people had recourse was the working of the deserted mines, from which they naturally expected again to obtain wealth. Several of the miners had been killed in the wars, and others, wearing the spurs and poncho of the Gaucho, enjoyed a life of wild and unrestrained liberty. There were some, however, who voluntarily returned to the profession in which they had been trained, and were willing again to embrace a life whose hardships had become habitual. But the forced labor of the Indian was now wanting, and although this system of cruelty had been long abolished in many parts of South America, yet its existence in some places, and the unjust encouragement which Spaniards had given to mining in exclusion of every other branch of industry, had up to the period of the Revolution greatly assisted the working of the mines. Operations were, however, recommenced at almost all the old mines. They were all tried, but generally speaking they were all abandoned, because they did not pay, and with little inquiry into the cause, the reason assigned was the want of intelligence and capital, and people frustrated in this object, and incapable of contending with the difficulties which impeded any step towards civilization in the insulated, remote, and almost impracticable situations in which they found themselves, yielded to the habits of indolence in which they still exist. If the above rough and imperfect description of the mines in South America is deemed correct in its general features, it will account for a phenomenon which, in visiting several deserted mines, I was for a long time totally unable to comprehend. In many places we found lodes worked to considerable depths, but the loads so small and the assay so poor that the constant remark of the Cornish captains who accompanied me was, that there must have been something got out of the mine which they could not see, or else it could never have paid. Besides this, the country was barren, and there were often many other local disadvantages. Still, however, it was evident to me that these mines, somehow or other, must have paid, or else they would not have been worked, and in spite of the disadvantages which were before my eyes, the natural conclusion was that if they had once paid, they might surely pay again. However, as soon as I afterwards saw a few of the miners at work, the problem was solved. The miners who are now in Chile, though toiling in the path of their early days, have probably relaxed a little from the discipline of the Spaniards, but the extraordinary manner in which they still work, or rather slave, is almost incredible. The contrast between their lives and the ease and independence of the rest of the inhabitants of the country naturally leads the mind to reflect on the sad history of the South American mines. And this history, in my humble opinion, sufficiently accounts for, first, the impossibility which now exists of getting more miners, and secondly, for the important truths that the American mines have positively fallen in value since the country has been free, because the contents or produce of the mines are still the same, while the value of labor, etc., has necessarily increased, and therefore that far from being able to get a greater profit from these mines than was extracted by the Spaniards, it would be impossible now to draw from them what they formerly repaid, and that many of them must continue deserted, for the evident reason that poor mines, as well as poor land, may be made productive by a system of cruelty and tyranny, when, under a free government, they must lie inactive and barren. End of section 20. Section 21 of rough notes taken during some rapid journeys across the Pampas and among the Andes, by Francis Bond Head. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Conclusion. Having now completed a very rough and defective sketch of the Pampas, etc., and some of the provinces of the Rio Plata, and of the governments and habits of the people, it is natural to consider how powerful this country must necessarily become when, animated by a large population, enriched by the industry and intelligence of man, and protected by the integrity and power of well-constituted governments, it takes that rank in the civilized world which is due to its climate and soil, and as in nature's great system of succession, nations and empires rise and fall, flourish and decay, it is possible that this country, availing itself of the experience of past ages, may become the theater of nobler actions than any of the nations of the Old World, whose obscure march towards civilization was without a precedent to guide them, or a beacon to warn them of their dangers. And far from being jealous of the superior strength and energy which a young country may attain, it is pleasing to anticipate the prosperity which may await it, and to indulge a hope that its young arm may assert the dignity and the honor of human nature, that it may liberate the slave, and against every threat or danger support freedom, when the infirmities of an older nation may have rendered her incapable of the task. But between this moral and political eminence which the Pampas and the provinces of Rio Plata may attain, and their present state, there is a distance which is evident to every one, though no man can calculate the time which will be requisite to pass it. The difficulties to be encountered must necessarily be great, and it is not an improper or a useless subject of speculation to consider what some of these difficulties may be. The great desideratum of these countries is population, for until there is a certain proportion of inhabitants, the provisions of life must necessarily be easily obtained, and people will remain indolent until necessity drives them to exertion. The overplus population of the Old World will undoubtedly flow towards these countries, bringing with it different habits, languages, and customs. The points at which the emigrants settle will depend upon the produce which they are best fitted for obtaining, and the governments of the different provinces must become more or less powerful in proportion to the success of these people. Some will rapidly rise, while others will be left for some time in the wretched state of poverty and inactivity in which they now exist, and the laws and regulations which govern the one will be insufficient, inapplicable, or contrary to the interests of the others. As the provinces become more vigorous, it will probably be found that the situations of many of the present capitals must unavoidably be changed. For instance, the maritime province of Buenos Aires already requires a harbor, and it is easy to foresee that when commerce establishes its residence at the new port, the government must follow. The language, religion, habits, and occupations of the different provinces will of course be influenced and affected by the quantity of foreign settlers, and the laws must vary with the exigencies which require them. The provinces, as they become powerful, will naturally desire to be independent, and the possibility of their being all governed from Buenos Aires will rapidly diminish. During these or similar events, the provinces of the Rio Plata must necessarily be in a troubled and unsettled state. The national government, thwarted in its plans, deserted sometimes by one province and sometimes opposed by another, must often unavoidably act contrary to the interests of those plans it may have suggested, while the provincial governments must often suddenly be overturned, be annihilated and remodeled, until prosperity has afforded to society the liberal principles of a good education, which with time and experience will at last constitute governments practically suited to the country. If the state of the provinces of Rio Plata has been correctly sketched, and if the above should be a fair statement of some of the probable difficulties which these provinces will experience in their progress towards civilization, there are two questions to be considered which are very material to the interests of many individuals in our country. First, Is it advisable for those who are in reduced circumstances in England to migrate to these provinces? Second, is it prudent for those of large capital to embark their money there in any permanent establishment or speculation? My humble opinion on these two important questions is shortly as follows. A poor individual, or a poor family, or a congregation of poor families, coming from England to these provinces, will instantly be relieved from that part of their sufferings which proceeded from absolute want of food, for they will arrive at a place where coarse beef is cheap. Artisans will obtain good wages in the town of Buenos Aires, but as English peasants are not fitted to perform any part of the Gaucho's labor, they will not receive from them more than their board. Now, at Buenos Aires, artisans will find provisions very dear, and although they receive more money than in England, they will not be able to live there so well. The lodgings, which are always unfurnished, are shockingly dirty, filled with all sorts of vermin, and after all, they are extremely dear. Beef is sold in such a mangled state that when the Cornish miners first arrived, they often returned from the butcher's carts without buying the meat, being unable to make up their minds to eat it. The fowls at Buenos Aires are also very bad, for they feed upon raw meat. Occasionally I have seen them hopping out of the carcass of a dead horse, and we all fancied that the eggs tasted of beef. The pigs are also carnivorous. Raw beef is cheap, but fuel, pepper, salt, bread, water, etc., are all so exorbitantly dear that the meat, when cooked, positively becomes expensive, and every article of clothing is 80% dearer than in England. The society of the lower class of English and Irish at Buenos Aires is very bad, and their constitutions are evidently impaired by drinking and by the heat of the climate, while their morals and characters are much degraded. Away from the religious and moral example of their own country, and out of sight of their own friends and relations, they rapidly sink into habits of carelessness and dissipation, which are but too evident to those who come fresh from England. And it is really too true that all the British emigrants at Buenos Aires are sickly in their appearance, dirty in their dress, and disreputable in their behavior. A poor person with a young family should therefore pause before he brings them into such society, for it is surely better that his children, until they arrive at an age to work, should occasionally be in want in England, than that their constitutions should be impaired, and those principles ruined, which induce every religious and honest man in England to labor with cheerfulness, and to return from his work with a healthy body and a contented mind. A single man may imagine that he is able to resist the effects of bad society, that he would enjoy the climate and freedom of the country, and by attention save up a sum of money to return to England, but he would find many unexpected difficulties. The principal one to a working man is the climate, which in summer is so dreadfully hot that his constitution is unable to stand against it, and with every inclination to work he finds that his strength fails him, and that he is overpowered by a debility before unknown to him. He would then, wish himself back in England, and his absence from his friends and being unable to work would make him discontented with a life which hangs heavy upon his hands, and which becomes more cheerless because, unless he has a large sum of money to pay for his passage, he sees that he is unable to return. The above observations are not altogether theoretical. I particularly observed the unexpected effect which the climate had upon many English companies, and upon a large body of our English miners, who were selected in Cornwall for their good behaviour, and who arrived in the provinces with every inclination to maintain their character. They saw the degraded state of the English settlers at Buenos Aires, and of their own accord they kept clear of them. But the cheapness of the spirits and the heat of the climate were inducements to them to drink, which they found it very difficult to resist. As soon as the heat set in, the men were exhausted, and complained of a feebleness that they had never felt before, and this was so great that many of the strongest of them preferred going without meat to the fatigue of going through the sun to fetch it. This imbecility had its natural effect upon their minds, and they expressed their dislike of a climate in which they could make no exertions, and by which they were even exhausted while lying down or sitting still. And as soon as I determined on sending them home, they all most joyfully gave up the lucrative advantages which had induced them to come to the country, and none of them would remain, although by their agreements they might each have claimed £60 instead of a passage, and might instantly have made very good contracts with the other mining companies. But they were all anxious to return, and I heard several of them say to each other that they had sooner work their fingers to the stumps in England than be gentlemen at Buenos Aires. Note: we had all sorts of English speculations in South America, some of which were really amusing. Besides many brother companies which I met with at Buenos Aires, I found a sister association of milkmaids. It had suddenly occurred to some of the younger sons of John Bull that, as there were a number of beautiful cows in the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata, a quantity of good pasture, and as the people of Buenos Aires had no butter to their bread, a churning company would answer admirably, and before the idea was many months old, a cargo of Scotch milkmaids were lying becalmed under the line, on their passage to make butter at Buenos Aires. As they were panting and sighing, being from heavy rains unable to come on deck, Neptune, as usual, boarded the ship, and the sailors who were present say that his first observation was that he had never found so many passengers and so few beards to shave. However, when it was explained to him that they were not Britannia's sons, but Jenny Bulls, who have no beards, the old god smiled and departed. The people at Buenos Aires were thunderstruck at the unexpected arrival of so many British milkmaids. However, private arrangements had been made, and they therefore had milk before it was generally known that they had got cows. But the difficulties which they experienced were very great. Instead of leaning their heads against patient domestic animals, they were introduced to a set of lawless wild creatures, who looked so fierce that no young woman who ever sat upon a three-legged stool could dare to approach, much less to milk them. But the Gauchos attacked the cows, tied their legs with strips of hide, and as soon as they became quiet, the shops of Buenos Aires were literally full of butter. But now for the sad moral of the story. After the difficulties had been all conquered, it was discovered, first, that the butter would not keep, and secondly, that somehow or other the Gauchos and natives of Buenos Aires liked oil better. End of note. From the above circumstances, and many other observations which I endeavored to make on the situations of a few English immigrants I met with in the different provinces, I am convinced that those who have hitherto emigrated to this country, as well as those who deserted from General Whitlock's army, have passed their days in disappointment and regret that the constitution of every individual has been more or less impaired, that their religious principles have altogether been destroyed, and I therefore would sincerely advise poor people, particularly those who have families, not to migrate to such hot latitudes if they have the means of supporting themselves in England. In reply to the second question, whether it is prudent to embark a large capital in any permanent establishment or speculation in this country, the Spanish South Americans have certainly become independent of the government of Spain, and this has, of course, proceeded from their own positive strength and from the imbecility of the Spanish government. But supposing it to have arisen from the first cause only, still it must be admitted that a young nation may be strong enough to gain its independence before it has education, wisdom, or experience enough to know what to do with it. And taking into consideration the particular political situation of the country, I must own it appears to me that during the troubles and vicissitudes which must unavoidably attend the progress of these provinces toward civilization, it would be imprudent for a stranger to enter into any permanent establishment, for ignorant of what is to happen, all he can depend upon is that great changes will take place, that he must always be a responsible person, while unlooked for revolutions may cause the governments or the individuals with whom he has established himself to vanish, leaving him in the wide plain without a remedy, and perhaps even without a just cause of complaint. He may have treated with a government which has ceased to exist, or with an individual whose fortune or whose influence may have suddenly disappeared, and be like the person who came from England to Buenos Aires some years ago, under the promise that he should have a lucrative situation in the Cabildo, and who learnt on his arrival that the Cabildo had just been destroyed. I can speak from my own private experience, for I was very nearly in a similar or a worse situation. I was furnished with letters of introduction to the Governor of San Juan, and a copy of the then famous Carta de Mayo, which had been published in that province to insure to us religious toleration. But had I not fortunately been delayed upon my road, I should, upon my arrival at San Juan, have been instantly thrown into prison with the governor, who was already confined, and from the window of my dungeon I should have seen the public executioner burning the Carta de Mayo amidst the acclamations of the people. Yet I could not have complained, for my letters of introduction and the copy of the Carta de Mayo had been sent to me with the best intention, and the governor at San Juan had wished to give me a polite reception. But the event was a political tempest which had not been foretold. The failure of the Rio Plata Mining Association is a serious proof of the insufficiency of the governments of La Plata. This public association was formed in London in virtue of a decree, etc., from the government of Buenos Aires, authorizing the formation of a company to work the mines of the United Provinces at the discretionary choice of the company, and to promote this object, reports were forwarded from the governors of the mining provinces describing their mines. Yet on my arrival at Buenos Aires, I found that almost the whole of the mines were already sold by the governments to the opposition companies, and that the government of Buenos Aires, as well as the governors of the provinces, had been totally unable to fulfill the decree. Private interest and private speculators had overpowered their act and their intention, and they had only to confess tempora mutantur et nos mutamur in illis. Times change, and we change with them. The end. End of section 21 and end of rough notes taken during some rapid journeys across the Pampas and among the Andes by Francis Bond Head. Read by Sue Anderson.